All right, so this is going to be an attempt to recount, David's. This will be the 11th part of his discourse and discussion of varieties of rhetorical deception in narrative and non-narrative storytelling. And I say attempt very seriously, and to explain why this will merely be an attempt and not and that there's a certain amount of doubt that I have in my ability to perform this attempt without significant error, and and certainly there's certainly no way in which I'm going to be able to recount what David manages to perform in the 11th part of varieties of rhetorical deception in narrative and non-narrative storytelling, which he titles Danger, Deception, Delusion, Dramatikos, Eironicus, Dramatikos, Agnoreikos, Daulis towards Delphi, and Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of democracy. But I'll recount and perform my reading, elaboration, and or interpretation of this part of David's varieties of rhetorical deception in narrative and non-narrative storytelling to the best of my ability. And as I've discussed before many times, being having a much better relationship with the muse Paizo than with the muse Telaiasis. I expect that I'll fail. I already anticipate my failure from the outset to recount the complexities of his argument in this section, and the clarity with which he presents them. But let me go back and reiterate the title of this section, which for me will be part 12, though it's the 11th section of David's performance of varieties of rhetorical deception in narrative and non-narrative storytelling. And the reasons for that are obvious, and we've recounted them several times. But that is the discrepancy between the 11 and the 12. But to begin with, let me reiterate the title of this piece and as I'm formulating it, including all of the hypotactically situated subtitles of it, and then offer a further explanation of my apology and anticipation of error, and disclaimer, and also a spoiler alert. And well, let's just even before, let's perform the spoiler alert as a as a prolepsis here, and then I'll go ahead and reiterate the title and all of its hypotactical subdivisions in its entirety. So the spoiler alert is it's this moment in David's discourse that we could refer to as the anagnoretic moment and the peripeteia. So that's the spoiler alert, is that the anagnoresis, the not knowing, and we've been building up to this moment, and you can kind of tell by his title for the piece that it is going to be the peripeteic or peripatetic, or however you would transform that Greek noun that signifies a turn and a change into an adjective. and the anagnoretic moment, or however you would, you translate the not knowing into an adjective. But the title that David provides for this, 11th part of his, discourse, which is the 12th part of our discourse, danger, deception, delusion, Dramatikos, eironicus, Dramatikos, anagnoreikos, Daulis toward Delphi, and Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of democracy, in the implied in America. But I think he doesn't add the in America because, he's focusing on the alliterative elements. And we've discussed, the way that he used these alliterative elements in the first few words of part 10, his part 10, our part 11, and then the way that that alliteration of D's gets dropped out and replaced with these words that end with ion. And then I don't know if we mentioned it, but I always suspected that in that section, those references to ion at the end of the words, the morphological endings, that those particular complex morphological forms take were a reference to Socrates' ion and his discussion of poetry. And if that's the case, then it's interesting because delusion could be considered the malignant end of the malignant end of the poetic madness, especially as it relates to this last part of this title, Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of democracy, and we'll get to why and how maybe David anticipated in this kind of Cassandrian, or perhaps, since we're going to be discussing Oedipus, as is obvious from the reference to Daulis toward Delphi, and so perhaps a better prophetic analogy would be to Tiresias, the blind prophet, although David certainly isn't blind, but we'll get there. But even even in this title and the one could say the species names that separate and identify the distinction between the two Dramatikos. And we'll get to who those Dramatikos characters are that he's referring to, but in the species name, if those are genuses, Dramatikos, eironicus, and Dramatikos, anagnoreikos, there's a suggestion, right, already that this is going to be the peripeteia and the anagnoreikos in David's discussion, and so that's the spoiler alert right there, and then I've already performed either digressively or proleptically. I've already performed kind of apology and anticipation of future failures and mistakes that I'm going to make in recounting David's discourse here, and perhaps I should make another apology or a final and concluding a final and concluding disclaimer before I go ahead and repeat or reiterate, if you prefer, the entirety of the title for this piece, which has never actually been uttered. I haven't uttered it yet in its entirety, but you can piece it together from what you know about this series, and you can piece it together from the elements of the various, hypotactically organized, sets and subsets of the title that I have, referred to in this piece. But that final, disclaimer or apology is simply going to be that it's simply going to be that this section it's fairly, complex and sophisticated in its narratological and metapoetically paranarratological strategies, unlike what we've had to recount so far. So what David has performed so far in the first 10 of his segmentations of this discourse has been fairly simple and straightforward, both metapoetically and paranarratologically. And so I've been able to discuss and reiterate it, fairly easily. In this 11th section, which is of course our 12th section, both the metapoetic and the paranarratological strategies become much more involved and complex, sophisticated, elaborate, and in a sense confusing. And even though the title that David gives to this piece already seems fairly paratactically overwhelming, right? And perhaps deceptively alliteratively. Okay. Let's back up and see if we can see if I approach that noun phrase again, my mouth will be more responsive to my mind's desire to articulate it. And even though the paratactical organization, the paratactical expression of the title, which is deceptively, alliteratively disarming, and perhaps has a certain amount of comic effect. It belies the fact that there is, nevertheless, even though there's a long list here: danger, deception, delusion, Dramatikos, eironicus, Dramatikos, anagnoreikos, Daulis toward Delphi, and Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of democracy. Even though that list, that alliterative list, appears to be it's kind of deceptively deceptively exhaustive, right? Like you would think that he threw in everything that's going to be going on. In fact, there's a lot that he talks about that's going on that's not there, like the return to the idea of a comedy of errors, and the return to the idea of a comedy of errors, beginning with a confusion of names, or that question, well, what if in this story everyone was named Mary, and what would that mean? And that being, of course, a reference to the final or 16th part of David's discussion, which we'll get to, either at that moment in which we discuss that as our 17th section, or if we decide to configure it as an analepsis, then prior to that, and then we can reorganize the elements of David's piece. So the organization of elements and arrangement, right? Under Symphonia is another element that he returns to, but Symphonia is left out. The idea of the comedy of errors is left out. There's a lot that's left out, and the title, and perhaps perhaps the alliteration in the title, becomes right the dominant that organizes these exclusions. For metapoetic reasons that may not be obvious, right? So that apophysis, which is the section that he begins with, is is here, in a certain way, by default, I guess, which is another D word, but is not included in this title that he provides it. But apophasis is in a certain way, there by default, but not apophasis as it relates to the personification of a principle, as I think he began with, but rather, the apophasis of everything that was excluded, by virtue of the fact, or under the aegis of the fact, or because of the fact, or caused by the fact that it didn't begin with a D. And I think there's a certain play there, and that play is not a comedy of errors, but rather a comedy of terrors, and it belongs to. It belongs to anxieties that emerge from this concern over the fact that this last part of the title, Donald's December Declaration toward the Destruction of Democracy, represents a moment in our American history in which a truly fascist presidential candidate potentially, has the ability to do, precisely what Adolf Hitler did in Germany in the early part of the 20th century, without making reference to all of this. And sort of, by an analogical means of apophasis or paralepsis, David, kind of hints at that, Hitler too was always already a criminal, right? And had even spent some time in prison, prior to being released by the German chancellor, and then made his bid, and Trump has committed criminal offenses that should exclude him as a possibility for presidential candidate, right? And he's essentially committed treason and violated Constitution, and his role in the January 6th riots should, by default, which is another D word, I guess, that's excluded from David's title, he should not even have the right to run, and the absence, right, the absence of justice and conscience and an ethical understanding of the obligations and duties, of membership to the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, are essentially, and now, of course, the Supreme Court of the United States as well, the absence of an understanding of the ethics and obligations and duties and demands, of all of those offices is no longer a feature that informs the roles and activities of members of our government, and therefore Trump has not been convicted of the crimes against America of which he is guilty already, and the outrageousness, right, of being able to declare this candidacy for president when in fact he's constitutionally, right, disallowed, which is another D word that he didn't include in this title, but disallowed, right, from engaging in any future elections, for any office, and shouldn't have the right, to present himself as a candidate for any federal or state office, following his deeds, which is another D word that's not included David's 11th segment of this discussion, varieties of rhetorical deception and narrative and non-narrative storytelling. But at least the way that I read it, the title and what's left out of the title and what's included, sort of underscores, the relationship between this initial element, danger, which I guess we could underline, but we could underline all of them. Maybe alliteration is the means of underscoring, the social political impact and the importance of and seriousness, of the discussion, even though this part of the discussion bears upon the relationship between Greek tragedy and Greek comedy, and therefore between Melpomene and Thalia, and some of the differences in the way that they organize discourse. But one could perhaps underscore each of these words with perhaps the Greek segment in the middle, excluded from that underscoring, and then we could underscore it like danger, deception, delusion, and Donald's December declaration towards the destruction of America, and that underscoring is provided by, poetically, by the alliterative elements of the D. At least, that's the way that I read it. And, perhaps others will read it that way as well. All right, so let's go back and imagine that we're beginning again, and we've already performed our apologies and our anticipations of failure, and underscored the difference between David's ability to hold all of this in memory and our inability to do that, and we've provided the spoiler alerts, and we've and all of the disclaimers and necessary, so let's go ahead and articulate, clearly and concisely what we're going to do today. So this is going to be the performance, of a discourse called Notes Toward a Metapoetics of Paranarratology 1, which is subtitled a 17-part reading, elaboration, and or interpretation of David Antin's Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling, and then the hypothetically subdivided subsection of that is part 12, danger, deception, delusion, Dramatikos, eironicus, Dramatikos, anagnoreikos, Daulis toward Delphi, and Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of democracy, and I'll add, in America. David at the outset begins with explaining where he wants to go, and where we are and where he wants to go. And we've just talked about danger, deception, delusion, and recognition, and how one would recognize whether an eastern green mamba was an eastern green mamba and not a western green mamba, and how one would determine whether that eastern green mamba or western green mamba, if it turned out to be a western green mamba, were telling the truth or were being deceptive, and by what means one might overcome one's fear of working with a western green mamba, or by what means one might, different set of means, one might overcome one's fear of being on stage and performing under the conditions, right, of telaisis, that is perfection, right, and stage fright might want to be one of those fears or phobias that develop out of a relationship to telaisis, but phobias might develop out of other relationships as well, right? And David says that we're going to continue along that line and discuss the difference between real danger and other and delusional danger, but but these delusional dangers that he argues that he's going to discuss today don't belong to a relationship to lysis, that is, like this fear of getting something wrong or being imperfect, but rather to different psychological domains, delusional domains, that can get categorized in different ways, but these delusional domains, could be delusions of masculinity, narcissistic delusions, delusions delusions that result, right, from a disparity between an ideal and whether that ideal has whether that ideal is either positive or negative or charged in whatever manner it's charged in, and one's and one's sense of oneself as let's put it this way, one sense of oneself as being a copy, a kind of cardboard cutout copy of that particular model, and the delusions, right, and the reaction formations, one could say, that grow out of this concern for the disparity, between the model and the lived experience of self, and the need to continuously misinform and deceive others regarding the proximity of the narrative identity to the model. And then he's moving toward, of course, a discussion of Donald Trump, but he says that where he wants to begin is he wants to begin with a comparison between that story that of Oedipus, and he makes note to that particular segment of this discussion in which he began comparing the distinctions between Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus the King, and Aristophanes' version of that story, often neglected and overlooked, called the Smile of the Sphinx. And he says, although we utilized the initial reading of and comparison of those two versions as a road to understand Kathy Acker's relationship to Herbert Marcuse, I'm going to use it in an entirely different way, today, to re-engage, these ideas of delusional fears and fears based in reality. And then he makes reference to, once again, the delusional fears that he wrote about, and it's interesting because at this moment, he actually makes reference to what one could imagine was a rhetorically informed error, that is a domain of deception opening up, although he doesn't explicitly identify it as such. But he says, I believe I discussed, David says, I believe I discussed a list poem that I made, called Delusions of the Insane, what they are afraid of. And then he talks about where he took this list from, and how he further abstracted it. And he says, and I believe that I mentioned that this is included in a volume of mine called Meditations, and that, of course, is a mistake. He says that's an error. I made an error, and the volume, it actually appeared in is titled, it's the title track, if you like, of Code of Flag Behavior. And, and why, David points out, this error, or why, he perhaps invented, the error when he identified this list of fears as belonging to the volume Meditations and not to the volume Code of Flag Behavior, may relate to the final section of that he titles in the 11th segment, Danger, Deception, Delusion, Dramatikos, Eironicus, Dramatikos, anagnoreikos, Daulis towards Delphi, and Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of democracy. And the reason that this error may relate, to that title and to all the implications of that title is because Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of democracy, as it was performed in November, and we'll get to that error in David's Cassandrian, or if you prefer, Tiresian prophecy of Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of democracy, which he identifies as occurring in December, but obviously occurred in November, occurred yesterday, right? And this is, we've made reference to the importance of November 14th already in various ways. This is November 16th, and if one wanted to really read into it, we could say that a contract in phi through theta, also made a mistake and anticipated this declaration occurring on the 14th when it in fact occurred on the 15th. So we were a day early, and but not as off as David was, who made it December, but perhaps also there's a play in deception in that as well. Maybe David's Tiresian or Cassandrian muse was well aware that this event would occur in November, and he made the error in the organization of time. Under whoever the muse of alliteration is, presumably one of the thelixinoi, but who knows? I guess it depends on whether you're going by Aesop or Hesiod or someone else, but Hyginus maybe, but presumably one of the thelixinoi and one of the charming, and isn't alliteration charming in a certain way? I think if we think of alliteration as charming, and we think of those endings in part 10 that David provides, and their relationship to the ion as a reference to the ion, maybe there's an implicit and sort of subtle critique of these poetic elements and the sonic poetic elements that belong to these species of poetic form or for poetic elements, right, is a better way to describe them, poetic elements, and these sonic repetitions and patterns, the charm of them, perhaps belongs to the Socratic critique of the poetic madness. And maybe he wants to redeem or take Melite, his preferred muse, out of that construction of madness, but maybe by underscoring it here and underscoring the D and its relationship to the Donald, he wants to convey that message of madness, like maybe underscoring the D in the word madness in what he has to bring to his, discussion of that final section, Donald's December Declaration toward the Destruction of Democracy, and I'll add in America. So beginning, Notes toward a Metapoetics of Paranarratology 1, a 17-part reading, elaboration, and or interpretation of David Antin's Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling, Part 12, Danger, Deception, Delusion, Dramatikos, Eironicus, Dramatikos, anagnoreikos, Daulis toward Delphi, and Donald's December Declaration toward the Destruction of Democracy. David articulates the fact that he is going to begin with a comparison between Sophocles' version of Oedipus in Oedipus Rex and Aristophanes' version of this same story in The Smile of the Sphinx. All right, so he simply, to begin with, recounts what most of us are familiar with, the story as it's told in Sophocles. There's a play. And it's in that sense, in the sense that there's a plague, it's not unlike, David says, where we will be in the years, beginning with 2020, onwards, and he points to, this is his first prophetic or space-time travel, if you like, moment. He says, Donald Trump is and he goes back. It's like, in fact, this plague, right? You could say, Donald Trump is responsible for this plague, in the spiritual sense, if you like. He says, in the same way that Oedipus is responsible for the plague in Thebes, right? By virtue of the crimes that he's committed that he's unaware of. Now he says, and you can see him shaking his head. Was Donald Trump aware of his crimes? It's like, most likely he is, but he creates this delusional mask around his consciousness to present his fragile narcissistic ego, right, from exposing itself to himself, and in that way, in a certain way, like he is very much like Oedipus, who holds out against all hope that he's responsible, for the destruction of the spiritual destruction that manifests as plague, in Thebes, and he says, Oedipus, however, is as a rational human being, even in Aristophanes' version, though he's a bombolokos, he's not impervious, right, to rational argument entirely, as Donald Trump is. But he says, the situation in those two stories is very much the same. And he says, of course, the difference is that one is drawn from the mythos logos, and presents itself, as an embodiment of, all of the principles that belong to the mythos logos, and including this idea that, Rousseau Eliade refers to as, the eternal return, and the sort of, the genealogy of destruction, right? And this enmity between generations of the descendants of Kronos, and of course Donald Trump belongs to the future reality of our world, and his story, although it doesn't exist outside the patterns of history, is subject to subject to an engagement of forces that can, if they choose to, right, determine to to alter the inevitability of this outcome. And he says that, so one could say that, the difference between the story, as it's told, both by Sophocles and by Aristophanes, and the story that unfolds in the United States in those years from 2016, to the end of 2024, aren't entirely predictable and inscribed in the laws of fate, but rather just like those events which unfold in the early part of the 20th century in the democratic state of Germany, and like the actions of the democratic electorate, those citizens of electoral democracy in Germany, that the individuals in the period of 2016 through 2024, just like the citizenship of the Democratic Republic of Germany, will have the opportunity, to decide whether they wish, to be heroes in this particular development of forces of repression and tyranny, or not, and that's very much unlike, David, underscores the role that Oedipus necessarily plays and performs in somehow paradoxically, arriving at the conditions of his fate by attempting to elude them and to escape them, right? So he says all of that, in the background, and underscoring, the importance of this particular section of my discussion. It's anagnoreikos and peripeteia, and the way that these stories, that I've been telling of the past now bear upon the outcome of the future. In this section, danger, deception, delusion, Dramatikos, eironicus, Dramatikos, anagnoreikos, Daulis toward Delphi, and Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of democracy. Let's, having underscored the significance and the narrative relevance, right, of my, paranarratology, the narrative relevance of my paranarratology and metapoetics to the outcome of American democracy in the future. And, David is saying, and I'm breaking out again, David is saying all of this from October 15th, 2023, which should, strike us as being profoundly and dramatically, right, profoundly and dramatically, prescient and prophetic here. And then, even the fact that he's made this distinction earlier between these kind of story-like fables and the narratives they don't hold, and the way now these stories are tying into this narrative and one could say like collective narrativity of America's fate, being held in the balance between certainly not an ideal democracy in any way. The United States has never been, an ideal democracy, but it's never been an entirely fascist articulation of malevolent and destructive psychological forces either. He points out, and that's precisely what the stakes are of these decisions that will be made in this period between 2016 and 2024, in which one's role in what is not necessarily not a mythologos or an eternal return, but a kind of return to what history seems to have forgotten, right? And then of course that's the passing reference to the passing reference to the famous line from George Santayana, whether it's a misquotation or a quotation, probably plays into what David Antin has been working with here in terms of memory and error, and although I'm not entirely certain, but the quotation, whether it's a misquotation or a misassignment, is of course this line: those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, and we today, he points out from his perspective in the past, remembering the future, and as we've noted, to remember the future is much more subject to the particular distortions and misidentifications and transmogrifications that all prophetic memory is subject to. So the fact that David can perform this future memory at all and carry it into this discussion from this locus in October 15th, 2003 is really quite extraordinary, and we should certainly shouldn't fault the error that he makes in ascribing this moment of the announcement of Trump's claim to the presidency, which was actually made on November 15th, 2022, rather than sometime in December, as David predicted, or again, as we've argued, perhaps he's just playing out the alliterative possibilities and underscoring, in a sense, that relationship to the ionic, madness, or the this deceptive madness that takes over, and that David may be subtly finding in the verbal and acoustic representations of and kind of song, right, that alliteration presumably belongs to. So by getting it wrong and inscribing it as December, but underscoring the poetic madness, perhaps a different domain of discursive engagement is being made, just as Kathy Acker makes opens a domain of discursive engagement between Parabasis, the muse of transgression, and this idea of repressive desublimation, which seems an impassable barrier, right, on the road to the performance of this poetics that she's engaged with. So, in any case, he begins with just simply by recounting what many of us are already familiar with in our understanding of Sophocles' representation of Oedipus the king. So we begin with Oedipus, and now I can't recall, but David recalls. But I can't recall if we begin with Oedipus's conversation with Creon, or whether he's already sent Creon out. But But the situation in Thebes is that there's a plague, and it's a spiritual manifestation of a violation of law, and these laws are laws that are regulated in a certain way, by the destructive capabilities of the Eumenides, and the Eumenides, are spirits of revenge and vengeance, and are allowed to perform acts of destruction and terror if certain kinds of spiritual and laws that today an anthropologist might refer to as taboos are violated. And of course Oedipus has violated at least two taboos. He's murdered his father, and he's committed incest with his mother. And the fact that he's unaware that he's performed these actions and the significance of them doesn't much matter, because of the nature of the taboo. The taboo doesn't demand that one is aware of one's actions. One can commit the crime in complete ignorance and psychological, if not physical, innocence. And it's very much like laws governing the untouchability of the Ark of the Covenant, right? When there's a story in the Old Testament, and the Ark of the Covenant, which is an untouchable object because of its sacred nature, is they're carrying it, and it's about to fall, and without thinking, and with the best of intentions, presumably, a couple of individuals rush toward the Ark of the Covenant, to catch it and save it, right, from destruction, and then. And the angry God, immediately strikes these two characters, dead, because they violated this law that belongs to taboo. And taboo, somehow exists, above the realm of human intentionality, right? In this, you sort of say, meta, under the terms of this, meta-judgmental, notion of the sacred, right? All right, so this meta articulation of order and sacred law that today we refer to as systems of taboo has been violated by Oedipus, who's unaware of it, at least largely unaware of it, at the conscious level. Although there are hints that he may be and perhaps is vaguely aware of something awry and amiss in the relationship that he has to this particular community and to the events of his past, and the escapability, right, or inescapability of this prophecy, in which he was condemned in a certain way by the prophecy and by the Moira, by fate, to and he knows this because he visited the Sibyl of Delphi, that he's destined to marry his mother and murder his father. So the plague is ravaging Thebes, and whether it begins with a conversation with Creon, I can't remember. David remembers and is very clear about this. But Cleon returns, so he's been sent out, to find out, what's going on. He returns with a report, and the report is precisely what we've already discussed, that the plague is the result of a pollution of a religious taboo. Now, and David jumps into the future for the first or second time here, and says just as in November, he gets this part wrong, as we've already discussed. He says December. Just as in December, and he gets this part wrong. When Donald Trump, announces his candidacy for president of the United States, in the term, that will, that his presidency will begin, if he wins this presidency in the year 2000. and 25, and the election year, will be 2024, in which he runs, and that he's violating a law, a constitutional law, and he explains in the 14th Amendment, in the third section of the 14th Amendment, it says that if someone is serving in an office, in a federal capacity, and violates, right, the obligations and duties and responsibilities in relationship to the constitutionality of that position, that individual can not only be prosecuted, and but that will lose his or her or their right to hold political office. And David mentions that the Constitution, the Section 3 of Amendment 14 is very clear about this. So David mentions that already since I think we said that this plague began in 2020. He says in my prologue to this discussion. But if I didn't mention it, he says that already this plague that began in an election year in 2020 at the outset of at the outset of 2020 has been ravaging the United States. He's like using future memory to talk about this. This is will be ravaging the United States in this period, up to this moment in December, which again, is a mistake or an error on his part, and we've made that correction. The date is in fact November 15th, but that when Donald Trump announces his candidacy for president, and his new bizarre, and then David opens up his arms and says, and this new bizarre slogan, even more bizarre than his initial slogan will be, "Make America Great Again." Well, and as problematic as that was the new slogan, and he laughs. So we're a little bit off because you can't really see him laughing, but he's starting to smile, so we're not too far off. This ridiculous, new slogan, if it wasn't already bad enough, MAGA, Make America Great Again. The new slogan, Make America Great and Glorious Again. And apparently oblivious, to the outcome of the Glorious Revolution or what other connotations, this denotation, glorious, might have. And then he laughs. And so we're a little out of sync because he's not laughing. But he mentions that, and he gets the date wrong, and he refers to this happening in December when it actually happened in our time. It happened yesterday, and we got it wrong too, because we thought it was going to happen on November 14th, and we have the gift, or the advantage, right, of historical proximity, because we're in Trump's present, and he's in Trump's past. So his getting it wrong by a few days or a few weeks is actually much more much more remarkable that he comes that close than our getting it wrong by a day. But in any case, returning to the story of and not to digress, David says, not to digress too far into the future and into the analogous and parallel connections that I want to make between these two variations in the story of Oedipus, the one told by Sophocles and the one told by Aristophanes in The Smile of the Sphinx. Let's return to what Sophocles actually does with the story. So he returns to that moment in which Creon comes back to Thebes and reports on the plague, outlines the fact that this is in fact the result of a taboo, and and that the murderer of Laius, and then he specifies, right, and this is part of the title of David Antin's piece, the murder of Laius on the road, Oedipus's father, the former king of Thebes, at Daulis toward Delphi, right? This occurs at Daulis toward Delphi, right? Which is this is a split in the road, and the location is Daulis, and the split, one split goes to Delphi, and one fork in the road. It's a tриπλαῖς ἁμαξιτοῖs, I believe, is the Greek word for it, and it's this fork, and there are different directions, and this represents, obviously this fork in the road represents different outcomes and possibilities of fate, but in a way, and David Antin returns to this notion of the future citizens of America, who, right, like those citizens in Germany in the early 20th century, had the opportunity, right, when Hitler took over, and took over, by means of democratic election, they had the opportunity to vote, either in favor of fascism or against it, and in that sense, they had the opportunity in that particular election, right, to choose whether they were going to be heroes or not, and even though there's a fork in the road, on the road to Thebes, Daulis toward Delphi, that appears to be a choice, that fate is mandated, that in fact there is no choice. So you could say that the paradox of the symbolic value of this fork in the road is that it appears to allow choice, when in fact, it's a mask for the determination of fate. And determination, David points out, is another D word that he didn't include in the title, but that could have been included in the title, as well as, perhaps if you wanted to slip out of alliteration proper, overdetermination, right? But he says in the democratic elections in Germany, and then so he's jumping around in time a little bit, in this period in which Hitler gains power, he says, the citizenship, the electoral citizenship, if you were old enough to vote and you had the right to vote, you had the opportunity to determine, who you were going to be in the course of this story, the course of this myth. If you were going to be a hero, or if you're going to be on the side of the fascists and the tyrants. And the German electorate, in fact, made a choice, to support tyranny and fascism. And Oedipus, at this fork in the road, appears to have that choice. But in fact, actually doesn't, and that's one of the distinctions that that we can make, about the way that drawing from the mythos logos and stories that are predetermined, are different from the way that history unfolds, and we can say that these distinctions, however bad or good a historian, Herodotus was, and under the leadership of the muse of Clio, he says, the relationships to choice that a historian, and those who live under the domain of history, are restricted by, are different from those who live under the domain of a mythology, right? And one of the restrictions is that is that fate and the Moira are always in a certain way correct, and there's this paradoxical inescapability, and we don't have that, David says, like, and in the 21st century, in the early days of the 21st century, we didn't have that wasn't a condition under which the citizenship of Germany was confined in the early part of the 20th century, and it won't be a restriction in that period from 2016 to 2024, when American democracy is threatened either, right? And so each citizen of the United States at that point, who's eligible to vote, will be able to determine whether they're going to be a hero or whether they're going to be a villain. And Oedipus, in a certain way, certain sense, he never had that choice. He's bound by this prophecy and bound by all the paradoxes of the prophecy, which involve, the more you try to escape the prophecy, the more that it comes true. And this is true both in a certain way. It's true both in a certain way in Sophocles' version of the story and in Aristophanes' version of the story, even though, David's, talking very quickly here because he wants to get this all out. Even though Aristophanes' version of the story is much more complex, much more interesting in a certain way, and involves much more, many more interlocking sets of deception, which we'll talk about as we get to that point. But in any case, the citizenship of Germany in the early 20th century, those who supported Hitler, they had the opportunity to be heroes, and they blew it. They blew it in the election. But even blowing it in the election, he says, they still had the opportunity, for resistance, and there were examples of resistance. And so, even in a situation where, you're under the conditions, right, of this historical mandate, democracy says, well, you've got this, fascist president now. What are you going to do? You've got this, fascist leader, this Führer, right, the father, right? You have this fascist father. You got this fascist father, worse than Laius. The worst aspects of Oedipus and Laius combined, you could say, right? Or and even beyond that, worse than both of them in a certain way. And but you still had the opportunity to resist, even after the election, he says, right? And there were resistors, right? And then he mentions the Red Orchestra, he mentions the White Rose. Spend some. I'm gonna elide over this because we're really behind in this discussion, and I might have to break up part 12 into several pieces. Part 12 might go on a lot longer because we've really only entered into it now, and I think we're already something like an hour into the discussion, and I'm really pushing it beyond 2 hours worth of recitation, reading, elaboration, and interpretation of these pieces. So he goes on, and documents, some of the work of the White Rose in Nazi Germany and the resistors, and how, in this period from 2016 to 2024, the American democracy will have the same opportunities, and he doesn't, ever talk about what the results of the 2024 election are, and in fact, whether the fascists take over. And I think it's because the reason that he doesn't talk about, that aspect of the future is because he wants to ensure that he maintains this distinction between, the fate, right, that's inscribed within the mythologos, the mythology, and the way that, both comedy to a less extent, but certainly tragedy to a greater extent, is bound by the selection of material in a way that, history is in a certain way, bound by also by a certain kind of selection of material, but a very different kind of selection of material with a very different organization of the metaphysics and laws of cause and effect and outcome and determination in relationship to patterns of the past and the way that those patterns are projected in the future, right? And then, again, he returns to that Jorge Santayana quote and underscores that. All right, so that's going on, and I'm gonna omit or elide, or one could say just prolapse over his discussion of the White Rose for time's sake here, and because, as I said, we're already way behind what David has performed in his discussion. All right, so he's still recounting Sophocles' version of this story, and the murder of Laius, Oedipus' father, has never been caught, and of course we don't know that. Well, we know, but Oedipus doesn't know yet entirely, at least not consciously, that Laius is his father, and very few others in this story are aware of that. Oedipus, promises that he's going to, do everything as a good, as a good king, to find out what the who this murderer is and bring him to justice. And in order to do that, he summons a prophet, right? He summons a visionary. He summons a holy man. He summons this man not a man. We should point out. David says this is not a man. Tiresias is a holy one, and he's entirely gender non-binary, and this was often taken. David underscores the hermaphrodite, the individual who combines the sacred gender of Hermes and the sacred gender of Aphrodite was often taken as a holy one, and perhaps based on some of the sacred laws of Parabasis, the stepping out and the ecstasy, this individual, because this individual, stepped out of the quotidian, normative classification of gender, was seen as transcending in a certain way these quotidian and material, one would say, phenomenal, in the phenomenal organization of ordinary experience, and becomes sacred by virtue of the transcendent Parabasis, stepping out of this domain of a kind of an inscription of an ontological domain that was marked by this character of the binary, right? And then he points out that these like crossings of thresholds, the threshold between the sacred and the profane, and the necessity of crossing those thresholds in order to become sacred was always a part of religious mystery and belong to the domain of the thaumaturgia, right? Okay, so he talks about that, and we're lighting over a lot of that as well, and the way that he articulates it, and like underscores the fact that Tiresias is neither a man nor a woman, but in a certain sense a parabasial and gender crosser and border crosser, whose powers and abilities result from the transcendence of these domains of inscription, just like the way that fiction is inscribed in a certain way, mythos logos is described in a certain way, history is described in a certain way, and you could imagine that there are entities, right, that belong to the space of tellings, just like the chorus, when the chorus in the under Thalia in comedy, breaks the third wall. So so Tiresias is an example of an existential sexual space-time border crosser, and thus is called upon to provide information that ordinary individuals wouldn't have access to. All right, so Tiresias is called, and he admits to knowing the answers to these questions. Yeah, I know. She admits to knowing the answers. They admit, to knowing the answers. Any pronoun that we provide with Tiresias will be inappropriate, to the nature of Tiresias, and David doesn't really know, this for whatever reason, David is able to jump into the socio-political history that belongs to us from that period of time between 2016 and 2024, but for whatever reason that he doesn't seem to anticipate changes and transformations in the discursive deployment of pronouns as they reflect changes in social sexual identity that emerge stronger and stronger from this period of October 15, 2003 into our present, and he doesn't seem to be aware that the pronoun they can be utilized fairly safely and adequately to refer to this character of Tiresias. So he kind of gets stuck on on the pronoun problem that we've largely resolved, and simply with the use of they, but I'm stepping out here to articulate that, but let's just I'm going to provide David with the pronoun they, and the caveat here, or the disclaimer here, is that David continues to shift back and forth, referring to Tiresias as him or her, or he or she, and that shifting back and forth is his way of representing all that we've discussed so far about this character. But I'm just going to use in his voice they, and narrate and reiterate what he says, but I'm changing I'm changing the pronoun. All right, I just wanted to clarify. We just wanted to clarify that. So they're talking to Oedipus, and I think initially they refuse to talk, and then Oedipus, and David remembers clearly, and I'm misremembering and failing to remember the story, but David doesn't. But I believe that they are initially silent and refuse to speak, and that Oedipus then gets angry, and perhaps makes a series of threats. He's easy to temper and easy to anger because, after all, at least in Aristophanes' version, though not here, he is a bombolokos after all. But even in Sophocles' version, there's a hint of the bombolokos David mentions, and we'll certainly get more into that later. So he says, give it up. Finally, Tiresias breaks their silence and says, give it up. Just forget about it. And then Oedipus flies off the handle and says, well, maybe you're responsible for Laia's death. Maybe you're an accomplice, or maybe you're complicit in it, the way that all of these Republicans, and David talks about the future again. He says all these Republicans that refuse to prosecute Trump and refuse to impeach Trump in the Senate are complicit, right, in the violation of this sacred law, the Constitution, and the third section of the 14th Amendment, and what's going to happen in the United States, if the sacred law is violated, and in its relationship to this future plague, and he mentions, and he talks a little bit about COVID and the devastation that it takes on the United States, and compares, the plague in Thebes, Thebes to the COVID virus, and he, talks about the rise of global fascism in what's, the future, to his position in time, October 15, 2003, but that's contemporaneous with what we're experiencing, and then he returns to the story. Hothead Oedipus, accuses Tiresias of being complicit, or perhaps the murderer, and Tiresias is angered and turned and responds, like me, no, it's you. You're the criminal. You're the one that killed, you're the one that killed Laius on the road to Thebes. And Oedipus, is confused by this, or pretends to be confused by this, and either as a reaction formation, defending, consciousness from the truth, and David says, and this is important, like how we interpret this. Like, does he really know already? And and then like his unconscious jumps in and it like wants to hide this thing, from himself. And the way that he does it, or does he really believe this? Is there any reason, to believe it? But he comes up with this, implausible narrative, right? He comes up with this implausible story, and we don't know if it's the same kind of implausible story that Kathy Acker, tells about Herbert Marcuse, or whether he really fantasizes this delusion of this story, like, and believes that this is a possibility. But he suggests that maybe Creon, right? Creon is in league with Tiresias, and that Creon hired them, and paid them, to accuse him of these horrible crimes that are causing this plague, and that he's not responsible for. So we don't know. Like, is Oedipus engaging in an act of deception here, or does he really possibly believe this? And then, if he does believe this, is it a result of an irrational fear, right? An irrational fear to know the truth because he already suspects it. So it's the way that his unconscious, right, is like creating this labyrinth of agnoresis, right? Not the anagnoresis, not the not knowing, but the not the not knowing, but the not knowing, right? To get to the knowing, he's got to go through the not knowing. And here's the not knowing right here. He's created this elaborate, perhaps deceptive, like the Green Mamba, or maybe self-deluded, like Trump. Like that, does Trump really believe that he's the second coming of Q, or whatever it is that he believes, and he laughs, like that someone like this tyrannical and stupid and completely uninformed, regarding the history or economics, the laws of economics, and that managed to lose his business, or almost lose his business, right? And only managed to survive in his business, right, by declaring bankruptcy, and then he forgets how many times was it? How many times was it that Trump had to declare bankruptcy in order to survive as a businessman, even though he's handed the world, right? Had golden opportunities from all of this wealth that he inherited from his family, and then continued to steal, like, from the rest of his relatives, like poor Mary Trump, right? And she, and maybe several other Marys, because he comes back to this idea of there being a lot of different Marys, and maybe several other Marys that he stole from too, right? And that, but the delusions that he holds about himself are so narcissistically developed, right? That he can imagine, like that he's the prophetic chosen one. Oh, we're gonna lose David here, and I'm gonna. Yep. Okay. We got to the end, because it takes me so much longer to articulate, these points than it does for David, who's very concise and not necessarily linear, but very concise and not slowed down, by the stuttering gaps and and ums and little spaces in time that it takes me to gather together, my thoughts and select, the correct words and remember the story as it unfolds in the way that it unfolds. So I keep having to, come back, to the to the beginning, and that's where the sync some of the sync problems with David's smile and gestures, emerge, and then when I fail to do that, you get that blue screen that's at the end of the various recordings of these various segments of this talk. All right, so where are we? We're again, that digression based on my error and my mistake of allowing the video to go on too long that I'm filming, created a digression. But let's go back to where David Antin is in narrating the story as it's told by Sophocles, right? We haven't gotten to the discussion of the way that it's told by Aristophanes. All right. So Tiresias has accused Oedipus as being responsible for the murder, and then in turn, reactively, and perhaps deceptively, or self-deceptively at least, and that's what we've been talking about, Oedipus retorts that Tiresias in fact is a pawn of Creon, and that Creon is probably the murderer, and then and accuses Tiresias of making a profit on the suffering, just the way that in the same way that Jeff Bezos has made a profit, in fact, increased the wealth of his business, by billions and billions of dollars, made a profit on COVID. Somehow again, David Antin knows this, about our future and those days of COVID, but doesn't know about the use of this pronoun they that he can employ in relationship to Tiresias. So anyway, I guess that's in some ways how future memory works. And so he says, just like Jeff Bezos, who makes in the future will make billions and billions of dollars profiting from the COVID virus, selling all kinds of misinformation on Amazon and all kinds of useless, formulas and snake oils, on Amazon, and exploiting his workers, and not providing them with adequate health care, and not allowing them, to unionize, and to respond, to the dangers that they're being placed in, in order to increase his profit, and he goes on. Just like that, Oedipus, accuses Tiresias for, of profiting, from the plague in Thebes, and then, he David points out they get really mad, they being, Tiresias, and then, hint at this truth in this ironic kind of way, because they are literally blind, but they say you're blind, meaning you don't know, right? You're blind, or you're blinding yourself. You're blinding yourself. You're blinding yourself to the truth of the matter, just like the way that the Republicans in the Senate and the Republicans in the House, blinded themselves to the truth that Trump had, in fact, committed numerous crimes, some of which, most of which, were impeachable offenses, and should have been prosecuted, in courts of law, and many of which, were offenses, great enough to prevent him from running for president in the future, right? And the very fact that and he says December here, that in December of 2022 he can announce his candidacy for president was evidence of the blindness of a great part of the citizenship of the United States, and a significant part of the American government will be part of the American government in this period of emergent fascism and destruction of American democracy. And then Tiresias goes on, and eventually he leaves, muttering something about the murderer being discovered, and when he is discovered, it'll be revealed, the anagnoreikos, the not knowing, the revealing. Apocalyptos, you could say, is a Greek word, but different Greek word, right? The Greek word apocalyptos, revealing, is a different idea than the Greek word anagnoreikos. And David has something to say about the difference between apocalyptos here and its relationship to, plague and future plague, and anagnoreikos, and as it bears upon, the consciousness of Oedipus's understanding. But again, we have to elide over it, or omit it, or jump, proleptically, to the future, and back, we could say, to the future of the telling of the story, and sort of editing out, that discussion of the distinction between apocalyptos and and anagnoreikos that is interesting in this discussion and that David provides, but that we in no way, shape, or form have time for here. So, okay, so then we're back in the story, and we've let's just say we've prolepted over that discussion of that distinction that David engages there, and Tiresias is leaving. He's muttering, and under his breath, although we can hear it, the audience can hear it, reveals, let's just use the word, reveals, apocalyptos. Let's just use that word, here. And David says, and reveals the fact that, the murderer is native of Thebes, brother and father to his own children, and son and husband, to his mother. And that's pretty confusing, for anybody. That revealing, that apocalyptos, is pretty confusing to anybody that hasn't, always already experienced the anagnoreikos, which is, in fact, the audience, right? Because there's a lot of dramatic irony here, because everybody in the audience already knows the story. And that's the way that the mythos logos works. It's not like in Trump's America, when people don't know the outcome of the election until it happens, right? Even though there's a certain amount of conspiratorial delusion, right, that goes on, because like even when the election results, he says, in this period of time under the rise of fascism, what you'll see is that even in history, right, which obeys different laws than the mythos logos, he said you'll see that even after the results of the election come in, like that these deluded fascists, right, will question the evidence before their own eyes, and they'll refuse to believe it, and because they believe that they're living under the terms of a prophecy that exists, under such conditions as these types of fictive domains, as described by the mythology of the Greeks, the mythos logos, they'll refuse to believe the results that come in these election tabulations, and they'll recount them. They'll recount them once. They'll recount them twice. They'll recount them 3 times. They'll recount them 4 times. And even after they've recounted them, it doesn't matter how many times they recount them, he says, they still won't believe, because they belong to this prophecy in the mythos logos, even though they're living under Clio, and they think they're living under the conditions, right? They think they're living under the conditions of Melpomene, Greek tragedy. Or in the conditions of drawing, right? Drawing the story from this predetermined, like prophetic, inescapability, right? And the delusions are so powerful, and self-delusions are so powerful that they will be unable to see the evidence before their own eyes. You can put it right in front of their face, and they won't be able to see it. Well, we recounted the results, and it turns out that there was no electoral conspiracy. And they'll say, oh yeah, well, I'll see it when I believe it, right? Because I belong to this mythos logos. I don't belong to history. I belong to the prophecy of, and he talks about, like this weird. He's like, and it's weird. It's in some ways it's comedic. He says it's certainly like resides under the muse of Thalia, in a different way than it appeared that fascism in the early part of the 20th century did, right? Which was largely tragic. And you could say, there were some comic aspects about Hitler and his self-presentation, But largely, the rise of fascism in the 20th century, seemed to occur under the domain of Thalia, under the domain of he doesn't get that wrong. I just got it wrong. Melpomene, not of Thalia. It seems to be tragic, not comic, right? Or at least under the domain of Calliope, right? As epic poetry, but didn't seem to be particularly comic. But in the future, it's going to be comic, and the prophets are comic, like this, and then he talks about Q and the ridiculousness of all and the absurdity, right, of all of these domains, like of prophetic, determinacy, under which the most absurd ideas emerge, like that whatever the election results say, they must be wrong if they don't correspond to this delusional architecture. Right? And so the delusional architecture is inescapable. And in that sense, even history, he says the delusional architecture for these people, the Magaites or the Magagaites, whether they're Magaites in this period, from the 2016 to 2022, or whether they're the Magagaites from this period of 2020, December, he says, 2022, because he gets it wrong. Or whether they're the Magagaites from this period of 2022, to 2024, and then he puts a question mark after that, because he doesn't want to go beyond, what could be the opportunities of choice. But he says, for them, history is just as determinate and ordered by fate as it is for the characters in a Greek tragedy, right? Who are bound, by the terms of this prophecy, and when they find themselves at this road, this symbolic fork in the road, the tриπλαῖς ἁμαξιτοῖs, the opportunity, right, the opportunity to change and challenge history, or to make, a choice, is just a mask for it's just a mask and a false promise for the linear road that the fate is already determined, right? That these three fates have already determined, for Oedipus's outcome. And he says, for these Magagaites of 2022, history is the same, right? So it doesn't matter what the ballot says, because you already received the prophecy from this weird symbol, that's totally insane, who sometimes has this name Q, or Q Maganon, he says, or whatever, and it seems to belong to this sort of apocalyptic vision of human destruction and the rise of the tyrannical Christian right, and he says, these people, the reason that they need to count the ballot so many times and that they can't see the evidence in front of their eyes is they belong to a different ontological domain. He says they belong to a different fiction. They think they belong to a different fiction, and they don't exist. They don't exist in under the terms of Clio. They exist under the terms of Melpomene. But this strange sort of a Melpomene, right, and this strange sort of this strange sort of Delphi, and the strange sort of Delphic oracle, that's so filled with malice and destruction. And then he talks about the connection between media, the right wing media, Fox News, and all these conspiracy theories. But again, we have to light over that because we're already way behind in our discussion. And I'm going to try to pay more attention to the end of this video and where we are. I'm going to go ahead and reload it because we keep missing our cue here. All right, so all these accusations are made back and forth, and as a result of all this, Oedipus, suggests that it might be a good idea to execute Creon. And then, that's his way of solving the plague problem, even though probably, unconsciously at least, he's aware that that's not where it resides. And David is, very careful to underscore where Oedipus's self-deception lies, and relate it back to all of the self-deceptions and self-deceptions and how do you transform disingenuous as an adjective into a noun? In disingenuity and all of the disingenuities, right, of the Magagites. Like he's very careful, like, to underscore that. Like, do they really believe this utter nonsense, or is pretending to believe, right, in these conspiracy theories, and pretending to believe that if the election results and the ballots that are counted, aren't in your favor, that there must be a conspiracy lurking behind the truth of this bizarre prophecy, which occurs in this kind of mythologos of their apocalyptic, future domain. And the chorus steps in. There's this isn't an Anabasis this isn't an Anabasis. That's I just performed a parallepsis. Not parallepsis. I just performed another parapraxis. I just performed two parapraxis in a row. The first parapraxis that I performed was I referred to parabasis as anabasis, and I wanted to say that the chorus in talking to Oedipus is not an anabasis. I said, and I should have said, the chorus talking to Oedipus is not a parabasis. In the same way that the breaking of the fourth wall convention and the chorus talking to the audience is a parabasis under the domain of Thalia in comedy, right? And the reason is because the parabasis is a break, between the fictional domain of the story being narrative, that is the mythos logos, as it's presented on stage, and the historical domain that the audience occupies, in viewing this representation, right? And presumably, the members of the chorus are part of the representation. So when they break the fourth wall convention, the parabasis, that later we describe as a transgression, occurs under the conditions of like a shift in the ontological or metaphysical boundaries of these two domains. But because the chorus is directing, the chorus could, in this case, be understood as a symbolic representation of the voice of the people, le peuple, right? Democracy in a certain sense. And so when they address, Oedipus in this role, it's not a parabasis, which I said was an anabasis. And then I said that I performed a parallepsis, which is another word for apophasis, which is what we began this whole discussion with, right? The difference between apophasis and parallepsis. But the word that I intended to say was that I performed a parapraxis, that is a slip of speech, either as it's discussed by Freud, or as an example of unconscious material trying to bring itself to the surface, or simply as like a cognitive failure on my part, perhaps because I'm juggling too many apples, or whatever it is, or pomegranates, or whatever it is that I happen to be juggling in the filming of this video, and the re-narrating of David Antin's articulation of in this particular segment, and I want to make it clear: David does not perform the parapraxis either initially, in describing the parabasis as an anabasis, nor does he make a second perform a second parapraxis in describing his first parapraxis as a paralepsis. All right, so just to clarify that was those were two errors made consecutively on my part in recounting, David's recounting of the story as it's told in Sophocles. Sophocles. We're still in Sophocles. He's at the point where the chorus, persuades Oedipus to allow, Creon, to live and not to condemn him to death. And we've talked about the fact that this isn't a parabasis proper because the boundary between the fictive domain of the mythos logos and its representation on the stage here isn't violated, when the chorus, turns to the audience, but rather because the chorus, is in direct discourse and conversation with Oedipus. The two fictive domains, that roughly occupy the same ontological status. The only difference is that the chorus perhaps is a representation of a larger population than is actually presented on stage, whereas Oedipus represents a kind of singularity in an individual, right? So Oedipus is a single individual, and he's addressed by a chorus that stand in for a larger community or population, but that necessarily represent this idea of the demos, or the people, right? So the demos, as the chorus as demos, basically tells Oedipus, no, we're not so sure. We're really not so sure that Creon is responsible for this. Let's let him live, and they convince him. And then Jocasta comes in, who we know because of, and we'll get to this, Dramatikos, eironicus, who's in Aristophanes' version, who's disguised as a messenger. But anyway, that doesn't occur until we get to Aristophanes. So let's leave that, David says, for the future when we start talking about Aristophanes' version and the importance of Dramatikos, eironicus in Aristophanes. But Jocasta, enters and she attempts to comfort Oedipus and tell him everything's going to be all right, and she also informs him that the prophets aren't always correct, right? Like Jocasta has no knowledge of this future prophet Q, or pretend prophet, like this deceptive prophet, like this ridiculous person, right, who couldn't possibly believe the things that he says, or maybe is so self-deluded and insane that he does believe the things that he says. Who knows? We don't know. Who knows what madness lies inside the mind of Q. He says. But in any case, Jocasta would say, don't believe him. He's an absolute nut job, right? Or maybe not using a word that was formulated by Trump, in the future, but describe him as saying it's ridiculous, to believe like this kind of madness, and that that relieves some of Oedipus' anxieties, and then further, she goes on and she says, well, here, I'll tell you a story about some of these prophets, okay, and why I know these prophets are complete, are liars and deceptive, and that most of what they have to say is utter bunk. All right, he says, and she says, I'll give you an example. Here's a story from my past, and so she recounts the story of this time in which she was informed by a prophetess, right, Sibyl at Delphi, that her husband, and her husband Laius, that he would be killed by his own child, by his own boy, his son, and she doesn't tell Oedipus, she doesn't admit, right? She doesn't admit to her part in the destruction of this child when she allowed her husband Laius, right, to take him from the cradle and to send him out into the wilderness and have him murdered. She doesn't talk about her culpability in that her horrendous deed, right, this child murder. But she does tell him that hey, look, obviously that didn't happen because we know that he was killed. He was killed at the fork, right, in the road where choices are made. That fork, that tриπλαῖς, anaxitois, where choices are made, that fork in the road where choices are made, he was murdered there by bandits. At that fork in the road, Daulis toward Delphi, right? And then, when she says Daulis toward Delphi, Oedipus kind of stops, kind of pauses. There's a little space, there's a little gap. Time slows down a little bit here. Suddenly the action isn't proceeding forward. There's a moment of contemplation, memory. What do you mean? Oedipus says, what do you mean, Daulis toward Delphi? I need to know more about this place. And then, his mother, who, he doesn't know is his mother, not quite yet, right? She goes on. And she says, yeah, Daulis, on the way to Delphi. And then Oedipus says, Daulis, toward Delphi. What does Laius look like? He says to his mother, not knowing it's his mother. And she describes it. And then, and then we don't know, because, who knows what secret lies in the heart of Oedipus or Donald Trump or the Magagaites, right? And whether they believe the nonsense that they propose, or whether it's just whether the conspiracy theories are just a mode of deception, for them to claim whatever they want. Well, I wanted Trump to win the election, so it doesn't matter whether he won it or not. We're just going to say that he did, and then that's going to give us some kind of justification for whatever kind of revolution we want to have here, right? And then he goes back and he talks about the attempted coup and the attempted rebellion and the murders that occurred on January 6th, 2021, and he talks about in detail about all of those incidents, and we have to elide over that again, but it relates to this idea, right? Like, did people really believe that Donald Trump won, or was the performance, right? Or was the performance of this belief, a kind of act of deception that justified, right, the insurrection of January 6th, and that justified disclaiming that Trump had committed any crime, right? In refusing to surrender power to the rightful winner of the election. So we don't have time to go over that. In fact, we're way, way, way behind, and we definitely are going to have to break this up. We may not even get through his retelling of Sophocles, and we still have to get to the point where he compares Sophocles' version of the story to what happens in Aristophanes' version, of the story. That's in fact much more complicated. But I'm going to have to skip over that. I'm going to have to skip over David's future memory discussion of January 6th and return to his retelling of Oedipus. All right, I'm going to have to try to rush through this, but I may get slowed down again because of my inabilities to avoid the pitfalls of parapraxes and other types of errors in memory and mispronunciations and misarticulations of what David actually performs and elaborates. Oedipus knows that there's a surviving witness, and this surviving witness in Sophocles, the surviving witness to the murder of Laius, and in Sophocles, this surviving witness is just referred to as a shepherd. And David, points here. He says it's going to be more important. The name of this surviving witness, which in Aristophanes is Dramatikos, is going to be important in Aristophanes, but isn't important here, the name. But he says, I just want to point out, when we get to Aristophanes' version, to recall that this shepherd that he sends for, his name is Dramatikos, all right? And this gives rise, to a number of different, problems, in understanding and confusions in the plot in Aristophanes that aren't here in Sophocles' version. And so Oedipus, sends for the shepherd, whom in Aristophanes' version is Dramatikos. Because he knows that he's the only surviving witness of this incident on the road to Thebes, and maybe he has all the answers that will absolve Oedipus, of these crimes that maybe in his unconscious, or his unconscious is telling him that he might have a role in committing, but he doesn't want to bring to the surface yet, and maybe. And he says, and here's another difference in the way that this story is performed in Sophocles' version and in Aristophanes' version. He says in Aristophanes' version, Oedipus is continually committing all of these parapraxes, these slips of the tongue that point to his own guilt, because the unconscious is pushing this information to consciousness. And telling him that it's him. The unconscious is telling him that Tiresias, they were right. Tiresias was right. And these parapraxes that Oedipus keeps performing are signals and jokes at the audience. Like, even your mouth is giving yourself away through the unconscious and all these parapraxes. Can't you see that? But that's not the case in Sophocles' version, right? But so he points that out. So in Sophocles' version, Jocasta is a little confused. Well, why do you want to talk to the shepherd? What does the shepherd know that we don't already know? The shepherd already told us he was, that he was killed. He was killed at the branch, to Daulis on the way to Delphi. By bandits. What do you want to know? There's nothing going to help you to solve this problem. We already know. We just have to find the bandits. She's totally convinced by that, right? And I already told you that prophets are no good because I told you the story about prophets. And then, of course, in Sophocles' version, he's not making all these, parapraxical errors, and thus, not giving himself away, at least not verbally in that form that we know, that we're familiar with from Freud and Freud's notion of the slip. So she said, "Well, what's wrong?" And then and he tells her, and he says, "Well, a few decades ago, or maybe it wasn't decades. It's like a number of years ago. I was in this bar. I probably wasn't a bar. They didn't really have bars at that time. And he's like, I was at this festival, and You know, and at this festival there was a celebration, and everybody was, you know, drinking and, you know, celebrating and making merry as we do, you know, at these you know, and at these, you know, banquets and these, you know, after these ceremonies and I got in an argument with this guy that, you know, maybe had a little too much to drink, and he told me, you know, I wasn't really my father's son. That my father wasn't my biological father. And you know, at the time, you know, just, you know, kind of made me mad. But you know, my father, you know, his name was Polybus. And well, I was accused of not being Polybus' son. And I guess that would mean that if this were, you know, truly the case, and I wasn't Polybus' son, I guess this would mean that my mother, Merope, you know, had an affair with somebody. And you know, and this made me mad. And I didn't like this idea. He missed this. He missed that he didn't like this idea. So he tries to elude it in a way, right? You know, or he wants to, maybe it's either eluding the truth or finding out the truth. You know, well, who are you going to go to? Who are you going to go to find out the truth? Well, if you live in this domain of the mythos logos, you can go to the oracle. You know, he's in Corinth, but he can take that road. He can take that road to, you know, that branch of Daulis to Delphi, you know, or wherever it is, you know, from Corinth that he needs to go to get to Delphi. And you can find out, because if you belong to the mythos logos the way that Oedipus does, you can ask the oracle at Delphi, and she'll tell you the truth. You know, she might tell you in a confusing and convoluted riddle-like manner, but she's you know, obligated to tell you the truth under aletheia, right? Because she belongs in a certain respect, you know, to this you know, this muse, you know, aletheia, the truth. Like she's not entirely deceptive, although there's a branch of deception among the Delphic oracles, because they reveal the truth in curious kinds of ways. You know, kind of like those weird sisters, you know, in Macbeth, right? That seem to, you know, belong to truth and the pseudologoi at the same time. So you know, it certainly belonged to Eris, right? Although you know, I would, you know, it would be difficult to argue that the Sibylline, you know, Delphi, you know, at the Sibylline prophetess at Delphi, you know, is, you know, belongs to has any relationship to Eris in that, you know, respect. So he goes there and he's narrating all this to Jocasta, right? And he asks the oracle about this problem. You know, well, who were my real parents? And here's where that ambiguity between deception and aletheia lie. You know, well, whose side are you on, prophetess? Right? Whose side are you on? And this ambiguity arises out of the way that the prophetess doesn't answer Oedipus' question directly. She says, she doesn't answer. She doesn't say, well, your parents are, you know, X and Y, or Y and X. You know, the father would be Y and the mother would be X, right? She doesn't say that. She says, one day, Oedipus, you will murder your father and sleep with your mother. And then, like, it's such a shock. What she says is such a shock, and so transgressive, right, of the laws, you know, that determine, you know, the nature of the sacred and the domain like that it violates is so taboo and unspeakable almost that it puts him in this kind of shock, and he forgets what the initial question was, which was, who are my parents? And all I can think about is the horror, the terror, of violating these sacred, taboos, right? And so he resolves, right? He resolves to circumvent this fate, even though he knows that, basically she has to tell the truth, that she belongs to Aletheia. And so, he admits, he's like, he leaves. He admits to Jocasta that he leaves. He leaves Corinth, takes the road to Thebes. On the road to Thebes, in the process of leaving his fate, he meets this man on the road. He's driving a carriage. He has an entourage. An argument ensues. The man tells him to get off the road, get out of the way. Oedipus claims he can't do that because he's a Greek hero. He can't submit. He can't back down because he has this deceptive image of manhood and Greek masculinity that he needs to abide by. He's not a sacred hermaphrodite, like Tiresias is, who's risen above, right? Like these social conventions and traditional constructions of gender and gender binary conditions, under which their actions and their deeds are evaluated, judged, and performed. It's like, say some man on the road, going in the opposite direction, whether at Daulis on the way to Delphi or somewhere else, like confronts Tiresias. Tiresias is blind. Says, get the F out of my way. David actually uses the vulgar expression there, and he laughs. Get the fuck out of my way. Blind hermaphrodite, and the blind hermaphrodite not being restricted by like these gender constructs, right? These like delusions of masculinity, like not needing to defend himself in this toxic masculine way. Just use his cane, wanders to the side of the road, and lets this jackass pass. No conflict involved. Tiresias can do that because he belongs to a kind of in a certain way transgressive parabasis that transcends the expectations and the determinate set of rules, orders, and regulations under which masculinity is defined, right? Oedipus is whether we're in Aristophanes, who recognizes as a bombolokos or not, still highly defined by these conventions. And he doesn't tell all of this to Jocasta, but David talks about all of this. But we're back where Oedipus is telling his story to Jocasta. So and then David elaborates on the need, right, that he has, to remain in the road, and compares it to like Tiresias, who they wouldn't have gotten out of the road because they don't need to. And so Oedipus says, so this guy's telling me to get out of the road, and what's any Greek hero gonna do? And I'm a Greek hero, right? I belong to the mythos logos, right? Don't I? I'm not part of history. I'm not part of Clio. I'm part of the mythos logos. I gotta defend my masculine honor. I gotta stand in the road, and if this guy tries to knock me out of the road, I'm gonna kill him because that's just the way it is. And it doesn't have anything to do with fate. It's just the way that I have to perform this role under the conditions of this kind of toxic masculinity, right? So then Oedipus not only kills this guy, that's the head of the entourage, but he kills the entirety of the entourage. And he says, and the guy, that you described, the guy that you described as your husband, the way that you described him, I hate to say this, but, that description reminds me a lot of this guy that I killed in this carriage or this chariot. And David remembers whether it was a carriage or a chariot, and that's my inability, to remember the story. Or maybe the Greek word for carriage and chariot, is one and the same, and then it's just a matter of translation or mistranslation. He says, still, we got that witness, who in this version, David says, is called a shepherd, And in Aristophanes, is given the name Dramatikos, which we'll get to, he says. But here, it's just the shepherd. Still, Oedipus says, that shepherd says he was killed by, a whole clan or band or gang or group or community of thieves, right? Robbers on the road. And I'm not a band. I'm not plural. I'm not like the chorus, he says, a plural representation of an even larger plurality. I'm just singular entity named Oedipus. So so if there was a band of travelers, and they're the ones who killed Laius, that can't be me because I'm single. I'm a single person. And then Jocasta looks at him, and this kind of strange argument, right? Being a single person, but it corresponds to the information and an interpretation of the information in a perfectly reasonable way. So all hope seems to lie in whatever this messenger, this shepherd reports back when he returns to Thebes. And that's what we're waiting for. And if he confirms that Laius was attacked by a band of robbers or thieves or thugs or a community of outlaws and assassins, then Oedipus is in the clear because it's a single individual. It doesn't matter what his memory says. You can just forget about that. Just repress that memory. Repress whatever your memory is, and buy the story, buy the deceptive, maybe truthful, who knows? But buy it. Buy it. Why? Because your unconscious desire wants you to be innocent, right? So as long as this messenger, who's called a shepherd, who's called Dramatikos in Aristophanes' version, but who's called just a shepherd here, as long as this first messenger first messenger called for, but second messenger to arrive, because, and we'll get to this, a messenger arrives before the shepherd arrives. But this shepherd, who was initially intended as the first messenger, because another messenger comes out of nowhere, but we'll get to that. But as long as this first sent for messenger, the shepherd, confirms his own story, it doesn't matter whether it's in conflict with Oedipus's memory and doubts, because we're just going to take the reconfirmation of the initial story as truth. Because why? Because the unconscious, that's pushing itself forward in all of this doubt that Oedipus has about his innocence. He desires, right? He desires this information to stay hidden and repressed because he doesn't want to take responsibility for it. So as long as the first messenger, who's a shepherd, can confirm his own story, and I can forget about my own doubts, and then we can find a band of thieves to pin this thing on, everything's going to be okay. That's what we're looking for. A confirmation on the part of the shepherd of his own story, and then a band of thieves. Did I say thieves? A band of, that's so interesting. I said a band of thieves. So that's another, and David doesn't make this mistake. He says a band of thieves. But in recounting David's story, I said a band of thieves, not thieves. And so that's another parapraxis, right? Which is not paralepsis, which is not dyspraxia, which is not dysgraphia, but that's another, parapraxis on my part. So, interesting. Thieves, right? The story, the deceptive story, perhaps, who knows? And thieves, the population that's subject, to the punishment of the violation of these sacred taboos, right? So I've confused that. But something in that parapraxis, seems to be pushing us along in the story. So we're at this moment, where he's revealed all of this to Yocasta, to his mother, that he doesn't know his mother, or at least he's repressing that he does know his mother. And then at that moment, right? That moment, David says, a second messenger arrives, unexpected, and it's a man from Corinth, with a message that Oedipus's father, Polybus, the same guy, right? The same guy that Oedipus fled from in fear that he would kill, has died. And Oedipus is so relieved, because that was the whole point of fleeing Corinth, was so that he wouldn't kill his father and marry his mother. And it's like, well, and it's surprising that to the messenger that Oedipus is glad, but he's glad. He's surprised. David says, they're like, well, why are you glad? Your father's dead. That's not good news. And then Oedipus, but we understand why he's glad, right? We understand immediately why he's glad, because he didn't kill his father. He knows he didn't kill his father, and he really didn't kill this one, the one that raised him, Polybus. And so Oedipus thinks that this proves the oracle's prophecy, disproves it, or manages to deceptively self-delude himself that this means that. And David goes on here, considerably, and does all of what we've promised, that he will do, and gets through his recounting of this story as it's told in Sophocles, and then begins narrating and accounting for the story as it's told in Aristophanes. But we can't recount his recounting in this segment, because we've exceeded the limits of our abilities in time to contain this on a segment for YouTube, and so I need to end here. So when we begin again, we'll begin at this point where the second messenger arrives and relieves Oedipus, apparently, of his sense of impending doom and the possibility of murdering his father that is Polybus, who isn't his father, but and then his and then the surprise that the messenger has in Oedipus's apparently joyous and happy response to this bad news. So we'll pick up this section of David Antin's piece. This is again the 11th section of David Antin's Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling, and the self-title that he provides for this 11th section is Danger, Deception, Delusion, Dramatikos, Eironicus, Dramatikos, anagnoreikos, Daulis toward Delphi, and Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of democracy. And then I've added in America, because I'm not as confined as David is by the need to underscore alliteration. And I've already talked about why David needs to underscore that alliteration, and so I don't feel as confined by it as he might, because he doesn't discuss it, right? He doesn't explicitly discuss it. It's merely there as the underscoring of it's merely like presented, sort of silently, but underscored by this repetition. So we'll begin there, and then I'll continue with this, which may be called probably be called, Part 12, Part 2, Danger, Deception, Delusion, Dramatikos, Eironicus, Dramaticus, anagnoreikos, Daulis towards Delphi, and Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of democracy, or may simply be called identically with what this piece is called, Notes towards the Metapoetics of Paranarratology 1, a 17-part reading, elaboration, and/or interpretation of David Antin's Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling, and then again, Part 12, Danger, Deception, Delusion, Dramatikos, Eironicus, Dramaticus, anagnoreikos, Daulis towards Delphi, and Donald's December declaration towards the destruction of democracy in America. Or I could add destruction of democracy. Sorry, that was an error on my part. Or I could add in America to the Part 2 and then just keep Part 12 in the title. We'll see. But any of those possibilities are open.